I was on a coaching call, I guess it was last week with clients, and there was a part of the conversation that has just stayed with me ever since the call. And it's not because the discussion was actually new, because what's interesting is this conversation really wasn't new at all. I've watched this pattern with women who are my clients for years. And this last time, I think I just sort of landed on some language that captures better what I've been observing for a really, really long time. And I think that's one of the favorite parts about what I do with helping women. Sometimes it's not really a new idea or concept that we discover in this work. It's finally sort of coming to a way to explain the idea that you've been seeing for a very long time. And the sentence that came out on the call with these clients was, your brain loves a closed case. If you have a pen or you can jot that down somewhere on notes on your phone or whatever, write that down. Your brain loves a closed case. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized this isn't just a coaching idea. It's not a weight loss idea. It's really a life idea. And once you see that, you start seeing this idea everywhere in your health, your marriage, in friendships, in parenting, in aging, in confidence, in your career, in the stories that you've been telling yourself for years and years. And there's actually a really fascinating psychological explanation to this phenomenon. But what interests me even more than that is what it does to us. And I want to talk about it today because understanding this one tendency of the human brain can really change the way you interpret things in your own life. So let me kind of start with a little bit of context so this makes sense. One of the things that your brain, I mean, has as a job. So one of the jobs of your brain, so to speak, is to make sense of the world. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry, I was distracted because my husband is texting me and it's popping up on my screen right in front of the camera. Okay, squirrel, Lori, focus. One of the jobs of your brain, like I was saying, is to make sense of the world for you. Think about how much information comes at us every single day. I mean, thousands and thousands, maybe even millions of little pieces of information come into our brains. And your brain can't hold all of that sort of, in suspense. It has to figure out a way to organize those bits of information. It looks for ways to create meaning. It has to. It has to decide, okay, what does this mean? Is this something that's dangerous? Is this safe? What should I do with this knowledge, right? And psychologists have a term for this too. They call it the need for cognitive closure. Now, the names aren't so much the important thing. But what that means is actually something pretty simple. It means that our brains would rather have an answer than sit in uncertainty, right? Even if that answer isn't complete or even completely accurate, it would rather have an inaccurate answer than to sit in uncertainty because uncertainty, being unsure, feels very uncomfortable. And so your brain doesn't walk around enjoying this sense of like, I don't know yet, or I don't understand. It wants to know. So it searches for meaning. It wants the file around that information to be organized. It wants the folder to have a label, right? It wants that file folder to have a drawer in the filing system. If you think about your brain as a filing system, it wants it to have a folder with a label and it wants it to be in a place that makes sense to it. It wants the case closed, so to speak. And that's really not a design flaw. That tendency has helped us as human beings survive for thousands of years. I mean, imagine, as they say, caveman days, hearing something in the bushes, or even now, you hear something, you're walking, maybe it's dusk or dark, you're walking for your health, and you hear something move in the bushes. You don't have time to spend 30 minutes or 3 hours gathering evidence, right? You don't even have 3 minutes. Your brain immediately looks for certainty about what that is in the bush. Is it just a bird rattling the leaves, rustling the leaves, or is it an aggressive dog that's going to jump out? Back in caveman days, to go back to that analogy, our ancestors needed to know if that was going to be, a panther that jumped out. And your brain looks for that certainty quickly and tells you run, right? And it looks for it really quickly because it's better to be wrong once in a while than to be eaten by a wild animal. And so our brain evolved very, very effectively to make judgments quickly, right? And in situations that involve physical danger, like an unknown something making a noise in the bush while you're walking at dark, when it does that, it's incredibly useful. The problem with that, the downside is your brain uses that exact same strategies in situations where your growth and learning actually require a little bit of uncertainty for you to grow, right? And so I don't think we realize how often we're doing that. We're jumping to that cognitive certainty before we should, which is hampering our learning. So here's an example of what I mean. Let's say you get up in the morning and you step on the scale and you're up 2 pounds. Now there are probably, I don't know, 20, 25 different reasonable explanations for those 2 pounds. Maybe you had a salty dinner the night before. Maybe yesterday you lifted weights, or you're retaining water, or you didn't sleep well, or your hormones are shifting again. Maybe you haven't gone to the bathroom yet. Maybe it's just freaking Thursday. Our bodies are wonderfully weird. So there are lots and lots of possible explanations, right? But what does the brain do? It skips right past the investigation and it goes straight to the verdict. My metabolism is shot, your brain tells you. Verdict reached, right? Or another example, it's summertime at this recording, it's July, and you go on vacation and you enjoy yourself. You come home, feeling a little uncomfortable, feeling a little bloated and puffy. And before you even unpack your suitcase, your brain has already reached the conclusion that I've undone all the progress I did with eating healthy this spring and the beginning of summer. Undone it all. I've ruined it. See, the investigation is over without it even really getting started. You miss a few workouts because, a parent was sick and you were there helping, or work has been insane, or your adult kids needed you. And instead of you thinking, okay, this has just been a difficult week, your brain says, see, you're just inconsistent. See, the file gets closed. And you see what happened there. Nothing I just described in those examples was actually a conclusion based on potential possibilities for what was going on. It it was an observation. The scale changed, that's an observation. You had salty food the night before, that's an observation. You missed 3 workouts, That's another observation. Your body maybe is responding differently after menopause, another observation. See, those are not stories, those are facts. The story comes after the fact. That's where I think we get ourselves into a whole lot of trouble, because somewhere between the observation and the story, our brain appoints itself detective, prosecutor, judge, jury, and the sentencing committee, all in the span of about 20, 30 seconds. And we never stop to question whether we actually had enough evidence to convict ourselves. And so I was, like I said, I was having this conversation with clients on the coaching call this last week, and I thought about it afterwards. I was thinking even more about the discussion that we were having. You imagine a crime scene and an actual detective arrives there, and he walks through the door and he looks around for, maybe 20 or 30 seconds. He points at somebody standing in the room and he says, "All right, I've seen enough, case closed." Everyone would think, like, what are you doing? You haven't interviewed anyone. You haven't collected evidence at the crime scene. You haven't looked at any other possibility. You haven't even asked a damn question. No one would trust that detective and that conclusion that he drew. But somehow we trust that detective when it's living inside our own heads, right? One awkward conversation with someone, they don't like me. Case closed. Didn't get the promotion at work. Well, I'm obviously not leadership material. Case closed. Your husband seems quiet after dinner. He must be upset with me about something. Close the file on that case. Your adult child is short with you or doesn't call for a week. God, what did I do? I failed as a mother. No investigation. You hit menopause or perimenopause, and your body is struggling with weight. Well, my metabolism is shot, my body's broken. Verdict issued. See, it's fascinating, isn't it? Because our brains are incredibly efficient. They can get to those thoughts really quickly. The problem is they're efficient with time, but they're not incredibly accurate. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Once your brain reaches a verdict, that first verdict, it immediately hires an attorney. And you know who that is? You. You become unbelievably good at arguing your own case, too. I never follow through. I always fail when I try to lose weight. Like, really? Never? You never follow through? Ever, ever? And I'm pushing you on that because I bet if we sat down together, I could find 100 or even hundreds of examples where you did follow through. But your brain is not interested in any of those successful situations anymore because the case has already been decided. Now it's simply collecting evidence to support the verdict that it came to. And psychologists call that confirmation bias. I call it being incredibly convincing as a lawyer for a story that may not even be true. And if you're a smart woman, which I'm guessing you are because you're listening to this podcast, if you're a smart woman in all seriousness, you're probably actually even better at it because intelligent women, we can build beautiful arguments. We connect the dots, you remember details, you create very coherent stories. Just ask your partner about that. I bet he'll agree with me. You're really, really good at putting together an argument. The problem is being able to build a convincing story does not always mean that story is correct. sometimes it just means you're good at putting together a story. And unfortunately, the person you're often telling the story about is you. It's yourself. One thing I want to intentionally avoid here is just giving you like a list of questions or like, three things to remember here. Um, I want to kind of push this a little bit further. So I'm gonna go back to something I said earlier. Your brain loves a closed case, all right? And honestly, I don't think that's ever going to change. So I don't want you to think, oh, you just listened to this podcast episode and you're going to rewire millions of years of human evolution by me giving you three tips or three questions to ask yourself. That's not the way this works. Your brain is still going to wake up tomorrow and want quick answers. It's still going to search for certainty. It's still going to want to tell you what everything means and do that really quickly. The goal is not for you to stop that. The goal is for you to recognize it. Because once you become aware of it and you can recognize it in your own brain, you don't have to believe every verdict that your brain hands you. You're not going to stop it from handing you the verdict, but you can say, okay, maybe about that verdict. Maybe that's true, but maybe the investigation isn't over yet. And when I learned to do this, and I learned through my own personal journey how to become aware of what our brain was, doing kind of in a way to sabotage us when it comes to this sort of a situation. When I became aware of that and I learned to just slow my brain down and go, okay, I'm not just buying that brain, Lori brain. Maybe I need to look for other possibilities of what may be going on here. I found that incredibly freeing. And it's not because doing that always guarantees a happy ending. I mean, look, you and I know that life does not work that way. Some conclusions are absolutely true. Sometimes we're going to get a diagnosis in life, for example, that is serious. Sometimes relationships are actually going to be over, intimate ones and friendly ones. Sometimes opportunities actually pass us and they are actually gone. Sometimes we genuinely made a mistake. Leaving the case open for investigation is not pretending reality is different than it is. It's just refusing to pretend that we understand the whole story before we've actually lived it. And those are two very different things and can have very different outcomes. Again, when I think about my own life, there are seasons now that make perfect sense when I look back, but they felt incredibly frustrating and confusing even when I was in the midst of living them, right? But if I had written the final chapter while I was standing in the middle of those seasons, I would have been completely wrong oftentimes because I didn't have enough evidence yet. And I just wonder how many times that is true for so many of us. How many stories are we calling finished that are actually still unfolding in our lives? How many identities, if you will, have we accepted about ourselves that were built on complete evidence? How many dreams and goals that we've set built around those dreams have we sort of buried because we've reached a verdict too early? I mean, I don't know, but I suspect that it's a lot more than we realize. And something that I've gotten really increasingly interested in as I've gotten older is the difference between knowledge and wisdom. When I was younger, I remember thinking that someone who has wisdom had all of the answers. That's what wisdom meant. It meant having all the answers. I think actually now I think wisdom maybe it means becoming more careful about the answers that you just accept. And it's not about, being indecisive or non-committal. It's not that. It's because you've learned that reality is a lot more complex most of the time than your first interpretation would have you to think it is. I've said for a very long time, and if you've followed me on this podcast or on my social pages, or if you're on my email list, you've heard me say it. Women, in my opinion, women don't need just more information. Most of the women I help have already accumulated tons of information. I still believe that women primarily don't need more information, but I think what they do need is better judgment. And I don't mean judgment in the way of like judging themselves. I mean better judgment, the ability to look at a situation and say, okay, I don't think I know enough yet. I don't think one hard week tells me who I am. I don't think one setback gets to define my next 5 or 10 years. I don't think one number on the scale deserves that much authority over how I feel. To me, that's discernment. And I honestly think discernment is one of the greatest gifts that we can develop in this second half of life. It doesn't always make life easier. That's not what I mean, but it makes us a lot harder to fool. Harder to fool by every headline, everything we hear so-called experts say, harder to fool by all the fear mongering, harder to get fooled by all the old beliefs that we hold, and maybe even most importantly, harder to fool by the stories that we automatically tell ourselves, because we've been fooled by a lot of those stories that we carry around and tell it ourselves up here. Imagine what would change if every time your brain rushed toward a verdict, you simply paused just for a moment, long enough to ask, okay, maybe, but what else could be true? What else could be true? I love that question. It doesn't magically fix everything, but what it does for you is it reopens the possibility. And possibility is where growth lives. Not certainty. Certainty feels really safe, remember, especially to your brain. But possibility is where people change. So maybe the next time the scale jumps 2 pounds, you don't have to immediately decide there's something wrong with you, your diet has failed, you have failed, or your metabolism is completely shot and broken, and that there's nothing you can do about it. Maybe the next time you have a hard week, you don't have to decide that you are completely inconsistent and have no willpower. I mean, maybe you are consistent, but maybe not. Isn't that the point though? Like, you don't know yet, and that's okay. You don't have to know, because life has a way of revealing things that panic never can. And I think one of the most loving things that we can do for ourselves is become a little slower to judge ourselves, a little slower to label, a little slower to make permanent decisions about ourselves. And I don't think that's having a lack of standards, and I don't think it's a lack of conviction or commitment. I think it's about respecting ourselves enough to take the time to go gather more evidence before we write another story about who we are, especially another negative one. So today, like I said at the beginning, I don't really have like the 3 questions that are going to fix this, or I don't really have homework for you. What I have is just an invitation for you to pay attention. Listen to the language that your mind is using this week. Notice how often it says things like, I always blah, 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 or I never can, yada, yada, or I'm just, or see, I knew it. Those phrases, those bits of language are clues to you, or they should be. Those are the moments when your brain is trying to close another case on you. And maybe, just maybe, instead of arguing with it, instead of just believing it wholeheartedly, you simply smile and you ask, or you think, okay, that's interesting, but I don't think we've gathered enough evidence yet, brain. Because what I want you to remember long after you've listened to this episode is the event, the thing, the behavior is not always the problem. The story we rush to write about that event or our behavior often is the problem. And some of the most important chapters of your life may never even happen if you keep writing endings in the middle of your story. So just leave the case open. And remember that one piece of evidence should never become a life sentence. I hope this was helpful. Um, Thank you for being here. I always appreciate these conversations, and I'll see you right back here next week or next time.